Good morning and welcome to yet another in the Elephant series of interviews with prominent public intellectuals who can throw light into this interesting era that we're in that has been caused by the coronavirus, COVID-19 virus. Today with me, it's my privilege to be speaking to Professor Mohamed Bakari. Professor Bakari is one of our distinguished academics, a linguist, and also been a lecturer and a teacher in post-colonial studies and literature. And Professor Bakari taught at Nairobi University for 22 years. And then in the mid to late 90s, moved to Turkey, to Fatih University, which is now Istanbul University, where he taught for another almost 20 years. He has come back home to Kenya, and he's now Vice-Chancellor of RAF University. And I would like to say, Asante sana, Mwalimu, for this opportunity to discuss with you. You've been around the world. You've taught in Kenya, you've taught in Turkey, and you've studied global civilizations. You've taught them. You've taught American literature. You've taught African literature. You're really a citizen of the world that we gave on loan for a short while to Turkey. So we welcome you back home, especially at this time where we need people with your experience and your mind to be able to unpackage for us the implications of coronavirus on our society. But let me first start by asking, how are you doing, Professor? How are you doing? We have this curfew. We have physical distancing, which is tantamount to a lockdown. How are you doing? How is your family during these last few weeks of restrictions in movement and interaction?
First, I sent out a notice to close down the university. Immediately, the government directed us to do this because I realized that this is a very serious issue. So from that time onwards, in fact, I've myself been indoors.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, it has been a productive period. Okay. Because I can work, digitally at home. What I miss is my library,
okay,
which I couldn't.
You cannot now access.
But I took the necessary literature, that I needed. There were a few projects that I was writing on, and some papers that I have to finish. So on the whole, it has not been a bad idea. And we at home are in total lockdown.
Okay.
Yeah, I have an adult son, who brings us food,
okay,
and does these errands.
Yes.
But again, we started using the masks, really early on.
Yes.
Because we knew, what was happening, outside, and the statistics were becoming increasingly alarming.
Yes.
So on the whole, in fact, I have hardly gone outside the estates in which I live.
It's very clear that the measures that have been introduced globally as a response to this virus are changing our society, and perhaps in fundamental ways which may be resilient. Some of the changes may stay. Previous major pandemics in human history have always changed societies in some way. you are a person who has studied many cultures and the history of many civilizations. What would you say can we begin to see as the impact of coronavirus in terms of the way we interact as human beings and the cultural, social, political, and economic impact?
First, I want us to realize that these epidemics, are really not new to this country.
Yeah.
Kenyan historians actually have studied the impact of epidemics,
Yes.
of all manner, that have happened
Yes.
in this country,
Yes.
before the colonial period.
Yes.
So we imagine, this is just something new that
Yes.
came with European.
Yes.
Interestingly, there's this very famous Mombasan poet,
Yes.
Muyaka,
Yes.
Muyaka Munyihaji.
Uh-huh.
Poetry, in fact, has some of those poems that talks about these epidemics. And these are things that happened in the 18th, 19th century. So these are not actually new things, that are happening to us. It's only the scale of these issues. So all these societies had ways of handling these kinds of situations. Otherwise, we would have been completely decimated. If there would never have been any of these communities or societies if they didn't have traditional wisdom, to handle these kinds of situations. And again, talking about these ancient civilizations, all of these have gone through more or less the same kinds of experiences on a much, probably much larger scale than ourselves. And we mustn't forget that although we talk of these great civilizations, but the populations actually in all these civilizations were actually quite manageable.
Yes.
Like if you look at Turkey, for example,
Yes.
Istanbul has a population of 17 million
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Yeah, but I have met elderly people, in their 80s, in their 90s there, who told me that the population of Istanbul, until very recently, was very manageable.
Yes.
Probably less than 1 million.
Yes.
So this population explosion is something that has come, with what we'd like to call modern developments.
Yes.
Medicine, technology, and so on and so forth. So mortality rate has gone down,
Yes.
But they have always, they've always been these pestilences and epidemics. But because the populations were manageable, I think they were able to control, for example, cleanliness of cities. There are actually evidences, like, for example, if you read the Turkish historian, somebody called Hilal İnalcık,
Yes.
Yes. He talked about how the regimes at that time had these health inspectors who went around,
yes,
to make sure that people swept, their neighborhoods,
yes,
by themselves. They kept their environment clean, and if they didn't, in fact, the head of the family, was actually whipped.
held accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because he's accused of not doing his job properly.
Yes.
So there was this consciousness about cleanliness.
Yes.
And, I'm really amazed because Nairobi has hardly 3-4 million people, and Istanbul has 17 million people.
Yes.
But it's such a clean city, you can't make it because they are constantly cleaning and maintaining. Yes. So there is that tradition, In our case, we have not really instilled this sense of importance of hygiene in our societies.
One of the things, and you spent 20 years in Istanbul, Prof. One of the issues that has emerged coming out of, not coming out of, but we're still in the middle of this pandemic, has been the fact that the responses of different countries in the world has been quite different. We find, partly because of their own recent experiences with pandemics, some of the Asian countries have been very quick and successful in what they call flattening this curve of infections, starting in Wuhan, in China, and the neighboring provinces. Same you can be said of Singapore, South Korea, have all been pretty successful in implementing these programs, these strategies for responding to coronavirus, and it causes one to step back and now look at how the world is changing. Since the Second World War, and especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, we've lived in a sort of a Pax Americana, liberal democracy, neoliberal economics, and that has been seen as the gospel by which societies, nations develop and grow. This has brought out the fact that we now have a multipolar world, and countries like Turkey, where you spent almost 20 years, have risen in geopolitical significance in the world. China, much more dramatic example. China, Turkey, Russia. You have giant countries like Indonesia, etc. And these nations are increasingly assertive. Perhaps maybe for some of our viewers who may not be totally up to speed with it, Turkey has taken a much more, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but it's a much more proactive engagement with Africa, as has China, as India, etc. What does this mean, and especially in this time of COVID, and what does it mean for the coming era? Because clearly we're seeing there will be the world that was there before coronavirus, and there will be a world afterwards. And I'm wondering whether you can reflect on this. I think you lived in Turkey when it was going through a major transformation from 1997 until just recently.
I think my first observation, after living in some of these places and reading extensively, I've been interested actually in understanding, for example, Chinese culture and society when I was an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody actually, told us, to read on China at that time. But there was an Australian professor who was writing a column in Newsweek, that I'd actually been reading from the time I was doing my A levels at Alidina in Mombasa. Somebody called Simon Lays. Yes. So he was using a pseudonym.
Yes.
to write a column on. But in fact, he was a sinologist, but teaching actually in Australia. I think either University of Melbourne or University of Sydney.
Yes.
So that sparked me, my interest actually in Chinese culture, Chinese society, and throughout my undergraduate in Nairobi. Although I was doing linguistics, but I had this curiosity, about other societies.
Yes.
And then there was a Japanese cultural center.
Yes.
Just opposite Nairobi Hospital.
Correct.
This was somebody, an institute that was set up by somebody called Hoshino, a Japanese pacifist, and a very prominent journalist. Yeah. And so he used to take students from Japan to come and spend a year here.
Yes.
Yes. Learning Kiswahili and also Kenyan politics, Kenyan culture, and so on and so forth. So he had an entire program, throughout the year, where lecturers from the University of Nairobi went and taught there.
Yes.
So I taught some courses on various aspects.
Yes.
For example, on history of Islam in Kenya.
Yes.
African literature and so on. And I taught actually for a number of years until actually when I left. So these young Japanese people were enabled, to understand societies other than their own. So they went back much richer, and we also had exchange programs, of American students coming to University of Nairobi and spending a year or two, So these were very, very enriching experiences, for these people.
Yes.
But if you look at our curriculum, it's Eurocentric, in a lot of ways.
Yes.
We hardly know anything about non-Western societies. Yes. Whether this was India or Japan or China.
Yes.
And we think these people have just come to us now, and started exploiting us. But in fact, we have benefited from these people for a long time.
Yes.
They were part of these Indian Ocean cultures and societies, because without the Indian Ocean, Kiswahili would not have been at the level that it is today.
Correct.
As a modern functioning language, because of the input, from these Indian Ocean cultures.
Yes.
And this cross-fertilization of the cultures, is something that has been going on for millennia. Yeah. And we imagine that globalization is just something, that started the other day. But in fact, no. There have been different phases of globalization. So I think we have to think about including other cultures and traditions, in the curriculum.
Yes.
Even at high school level, there's no reason why we can't study, identify some cultures or traditions. Yeah. And when it came to Turkey, I had also been reading extensively on Ottoman history, Turkish society and politics.
Yes.
And of course, I could only read, the stuff in English.
In English.
And the irony with Westerners is that they think that once they have their 3 or 4 experts,
yes,
they can tell them about these other people. If a problem arises, in these societies, they can always call upon their experts, from the School of Oriental and African Studies, for example, or Oriental Institute at Oxford,
Yes.
or Middle Eastern Studies, at Harvard, they can just call on these people. But these are very important societies, with a very long history and very long experiences.
Yes.
So, and when you live in that society, you realize that people are actually quite confident. As you said, because they can't brook any kind of condescension, from the Westerners, because they imagine that we have a much richer civilizations, much longer history. What do these people really have to tell us?
Yes.
For example, when they talk of the Middle Ages, they were in their Middle Ages.
Yes.
Their Middle Age was not our Middle Age.
Yes.
Our Middle Age, what was their Middle Age was our Golden Age.
Yes.
And so on and so forth. So they have this very strong sense of their own history.
Yes.
And cultures.
Yes.
In the world. So this is actually what we lack ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and one of the ways is trying to study other societies.
Yes.
And look at their values.
Yes.
Look at their traditions.
Yes.
And compare them with ours.
Yes.
And what we can take from them. And because, for example, China has had African studies, for quite a while.
Yes.
Even before they were a lot richer than what they are now. Yeah. We forget that they are the ones who built the Tanzam railway. Yes. Because that is what they were allowed at that time, because they were not economically strong.
Yes.
But they invested in these societies of ours.
Yes.
I'm not supporting the Chinese, but this is the reality. During the Cold War,
correct,
they had specialization. The Russians will do this. The Chinese will do that.
Yes.
So if you look at our stadiums, you look at these theaters and so on and so forth. In the third world, most of these were actually built by the Chinese.
Yes.
And I think that was also long-term investment.
Yes.
We thought, they're just doing these little things, but in fact, they were not little things. They were just keeping their presence in our mind.
Yes.
Not that they didn't have interest. Of course, everybody has interest.
Interest.
Yeah. So the in terms of Erdogan, of course, he's looking at the interests, of their society. Their presence, for example, in Somalia, their presence or investment in other places. It is not for nothing.
No.
Because it's give and take.
Yes.
You invest now and then you reap in future. So and they are fully aware that certain of these areas, are dominated by Europe and the US. Like in the case of East Africa, we are Anglophone. Culturally, we are replicas almost of these societies.
Yes.
Which is not a bad thing, by the way, because they were also influenced, by other people. They also learned from other people, But they prepare themselves, For example, at the end of colonialism, they set up, the School of Oriental and African Studies,
Correct.
Because they knew that this kind of relationship now is going to become completely different from what it was during the colonial period.
Yes.
We have to be more discreet. We have to be more savvy. In dealing with these people, because now they are better educated.
Yes.
You know, they have advanced, you know, to a significant degree, and they are conscious, you know. So we have to learn from everybody, you know, just like they did themselves. You know? So these advanced societies or these old civilizations, you know, are completely different. You know, their mindset is completely different from us.
Yes. Thanks, Prof. Perhaps you can share a bit, when we were talking earlier, you talked about African resilience, which I found was an interesting comment. Coronavirus, because it's a virus, it has no treatment. They are saying there are a lot of experiments to get a vaccine, but those are far away. It'll take quite some time, and so it caused a panic. But tell me about, from an African perspective, if we were now to say, we've seen what the Asians have done, we've seen what's happening in Europe, in America, South America, but lessons that can be drawn from our own.
I think I think the biggest lesson I think we should learn is, we have to invest in such, because vaccine development is not really, it's not rocket science.
No.
No. So why don't we have local initiatives? Initiatives. We have done for some of these issues. For example, animal diseases and so on and so forth, and we've been able to contain these.
Yes.
Yes, and there's no reason why we our governments also can't invest in in corona. Yes, in corona. Yes, because ultimately we have to develop a pharmaceutical industry just like other people.
Yes.
And they also started on a modest scale.
Yes.
You will not be allowed to develop to the extent but you have to be discreet. You say, oh no, this is just we start this industry and the cost, just for the cost.
Yes.
Yes, just to cut down costs, importation of these drugs and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So we have to be confident enough to be able to do these modest things. But here we are. We are waiting for Centers for Disease Control, in the US, to develop these vaccines, and then tell us, okay, now this is what is happening. The reality is, any cutting edge technology, that comes out of anywhere, it is never just given out for free, to other societies.
Yes.
In fact, some of these technologies, they have laws that limit when these technologies can go out, after a decade or so. Yes. So we are just waiting, to use obsolete technology. Yes, we can we can do some of these things ourselves. And for example, this is the whole point about the internet.
Yes.
Yes, because almost everything is available there. Almost everything. And that is why our for example, for our universities, I don't see any reason why government can't invest in data banks, where the government actually pays, for data banks, because these are too expensive for universities to subscribe to.
Yes.
It goes into thousands of dollars.
Yes.
So if this should be considered as one of those infrastructure projects that only the government can afford to invest in.
Yes.
And then free those resources for the universities to go into research in other areas. Of course, now we have, for example, Kenneth, that sort of consolidates, these access, to data banks and, but no, we mustn't, let individual institutions do this. It must be an investment by the government itself, because in the long run, the whole country will benefit out of this,
It seems to me, Prof, one of the big lessons of the past few weeks or last 3 months has been after really an ideology since the 1980s of small government, free trade, free movement of people, that this sort of economic model was essential to development. It saw many African countries like Kenya cut back on their investment in education, cut back on their investment in health and other social services. And then we have just seen the British Prime Minister, thankfully, he has recovered from coronavirus, but he was infected and went to a public hospital where he got first-class treatment and was able to emerge and continue discharging his duties. Does this mark a time when we need to reflect not only on the role of the state, but its design as well, given the experience of the last 40 years, when we've been going in the opposite direction of cutting the state down and saying the private sector can fix everything. And then this virus comes along that actually only as a legitimate state can deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting you have raised this issue about Boris Johnson going to a state hospital.
Yeah.
In fact, there are no private hospitals in Britain.
Yes.
Everybody goes. Just like the universities. I think there are only 1 or 2 private universities there. Almost everything is state. Because after the Second World War, they decided that they wanted a welfare state.
Yes.
And the welfare state takes care of those key areas in national life. Like education, health, of course, and housing. These are such key areas that the government really has to invest in heavily. If we want to improve the lives of our people. And when you say that most of these initiatives, should be done by the private sector, those are societies that have billionaires, and then not only that, but they have developed a culture of philanthropy, which unfortunately we really don't have, and we decry, for example, so much the corruption, in this society. US had a very bad tradition of corruption too.
Yes.
In the in the tail end of the 19th century, early 20th century, this is reflected in their history, in their politics, and so on and so forth. But as societies became better educated, and because they have invested in education, then people become more sophisticated and resist this abuse, of power, of positions, and so on and so forth. So we might think, our scale of corruption, is really, spiraling out of control. But this is something that we can control. Just imagine what has happened now. After this public exposition, of this abuse of office and theft of public funds. It has somehow somewhat mitigated, the situation. People are, becoming more conscious of this. It's not just, you have to instill certain values.
Yes.
And we can only do this actually through the education system. Keep on hammering home, what these values are. It reminds me of an interesting article that a Pakistani anthropologist, wrote. This is a very famous Pakistani anthropologist, Professor Ahmed, who now actually teaches in the US.
Yes.
He was just wondering, how come, Pakistan. The title of his article was "Can Pakistan be Japan?"
Okay.
Yeah. So he just wondered, why are we in this kind of mess? And these Japanese are, So he looked at what the values, of these societies were, and he said, okay, the values of, the Pakistan state are supposed to be Islamic values, from the Quran and the Hadith, and the values of the Japanese are in the Bushido code. This is the ethical and moral values by which Japanese culture and society are governed. And then when he compared, he said, these are comparable values. They're almost same universal values. The only difference is that the Pakistanis give lip service to these values, and the Japanese actually put them into effect in their practical lives.
Yes.
So issues, for example, like first of all, have you ever heard of a Japanese billionaire?
Actually, even if they are there, you don't.
No, nobody mentions about a Japanese millionaire, because these are, societies that care about communities, about society. Many of those leaders actually live very simple lives.
Yes.
The president of Mitsubishi, his kids are not driven, to school. Yes. They take public transport, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But here in Kenya, we are a relatively poor country, but we already have billionaires.
Yes.
But John, I would be very happy if you just give me a name of one Japanese billionaire.
Now that you've asked me, I know they are there because this is an industrialized country for a long time now, with very major industries that export to everyone. Even if they have billionaires, these are people who keep a low profile. The culture of conspicuous consumption.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sometimes characterizes our behavior here when we make money is not apparent in Japan in the same way. It's almost frowned upon for you to be flashy and garish, to flaunt your wealth in the faces of other people.
Yeah. So these are some of the values, that we really need to instill, in our societies.
Yes.
Because if we don't do that, then we will be just, we'll be just living the same kind of life.
That's right.
And whoever comes, we have the same kind of attitude, that, I have to enrich myself. That's why I've been put in this position. Nothing to do, with committing yourself, to the betterment of the larger society.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor. It's one of the things that people have been hoping against hope is that the fact that our leadership cannot fly out of the country for treatment for coronavirus, that this may provoke a bit of a change in the mindsets of many to invest in our public health system in a much more effective way, and instead of removing resources from health and education, realize that we've got to invest in this because with coronavirus, because of the lockdowns and the travel ban, we cannot travel to other countries. There's certain capacities we realized we have to have ourselves. I'm very grateful for your time. I would like to say shukran, asante sana, and I hope you'll allow us to come back to you again. This is something that is changing our society in real time. We're living the change, and I'll be very grateful to be able to come back to you again and reflect on some of the changes that will continue to happen around us.
I'm also privileged, John, to have communicated with you. I've been reading so much about you. I've been reading, what you have been writing also, and I'm really grateful to Yvonne.
Yes.
Jambo, our finest novelist.
Yes. Yes.
To connect to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, and have a good rest of the day, and stay safe, all you and your family.
Yeah, I do.
Thank you, sir.